Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Lamb, and I was assigned chapters 4 and 5 of Whistling Vivaldi. So, chapter 4 is titled A Broader View of Identity in the Lives of Anatole Broyard, Amin Maalouf, and the Rest of Us. Anatole Broyard was the New York Times book reviewer for 18 years, and he was a writer as well. He was a Black man who grew up in Brooklyn, but he passed as white or assumed a white identity for his entire adult life. When his father was growing up, he also chose to pass as white. However, his father only passed during the workday, so he was a carpenter, and he chose to pass in order to join the Carpenters Union and to get work. But Anatole Broyard passed as white in his entire life, all areas of his life, and even his children were not aware of his Black identity until shortly before he passed away. So he grew up, as I said, in Brooklyn, and he grew up as a Black man, and he joined the Army toward the end of World War II. And it was during that time that something shifted, and he chose to shift his racial identity. And so he spent his entire adult life living as a white man. And by changing his racial identity, he changed the contingencies that went with it, meaning he changed the constraints that he would face and also any opportunities that he would be given. Even though nothing physically changed, he obviously was still a Black man. He was able to open up different pathways for himself by living his life as a white man. So contingencies are conditions in a setting that reward some behaviors and punish others, and those contingencies determine how we respond in different settings. The most influential identity contingencies are those that threaten us, for example, a stereotype threat, or those that restrict access to opportunity. Steele gave a lecture at the Radcliffe Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he talked about social identities, and he talked about a variety of them, race and age and sexual orientation and all of that. And then after the lecture, he received an email from a student who had attended the lecture who had bipolar disorder, and she spoke about opportunities that she felt she might be denied because she has bipolar disorder, and the fact that she feels she can't speak openly about that situation for fear of what consequences it might have in the future. And Steele calls that a diffuse threat, which is a threat that is not focused, or in other words, it's very broad and vague, and it requires constant vigilance for possible threats. So, for example, the student with bipolar disorder had not received a specific challenge as a result of her disorder, but she feared that she might not be given opportunities for jobs or things of that nature because of her bipolar disorder. Steele refers to diffuse threats as a snake loose in the house, meaning you have to be constantly aware of it because you're not sure what problems might arise. Amin Maalouf was a French essayist and novelist, and he is the author of a book titled In the Name of Identity, Violence, and the Need to Belong. And the primary question of that book is, why do so many people commit crimes and violence in the name of identity? So Maalouf's theory is that people will do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do in order to defend an identity that they connect with or relate to. So in other words, there are things that you might not do individually, but if you feel that one of your identities is threatened, you're able to do things that would ordinarily be out of character or out of your comfort zone, specifically with regard to violence. And as was mentioned earlier, being threatened or feeling that one of your identities is threatened is the most influential to your identity. So the theory there is that people connect most strongly to whichever identity they feel is at risk. So if they feel that they are being threatened because of their race or because of their gender, they will most strongly identify with that aspect of their character. And that relates back to Steele's swimming pool experience that he mentions earlier in the book, where he says that he had minimal interest in his identity as an African American man until it presented him with a restriction, specifically being restricted access to the swimming pool. And then he felt that he became sort of hyper-focused on his identity and very, very aware of it. In this chapter, Steele also mentions James Comer, who presents a strategy for dealing with the concept of identity threat, and that is referred to as a strategy of probabilities. So Comer's advice is that if you feel an identity is being threatened, you should give essentially 3 chances for that to be proved. So he says that if you perceive a threat once, you should ignore it, and then twice you should ignore it, and then the third time, as he says, you should raise all hell, because chances are that the first cue is innocent or innocuous, and not intended to be a threat. And that can serve to alleviate some of the stress and tension and worries that people carry around, being constantly vigilant, as I said, with those diffuse threats of thinking that something may happen. If you assume that the first factor is innocent, then it helps alleviate some of those worries. So there was also an experiment mentioned in this chapter that was performed at Bristol Laboratory. And that involved a group of 64 14 and 15-year-olds, boys, and they were put in a situation where a series of dots flashed on a screen, and they were supposed to estimate the number of dots that they saw. And then they were assigned a label of an overestimator or an underestimator, but those titles were assigned randomly and were essentially meaningless. And then those boys were separated into cubicles, and they were supposed to assign points to 2 boys, one from the overestimating group and one from the underestimating group. And it was found that the boys tended to favor the members of their own group. That was also repeated in a second experiment where boys were separated based on their preference between 2 different paintings, and the findings were repeated in that. And in fact, the findings have been replicated over 1,000 times with various groups. That is known as the minimal group effect, where people tend to think well of their groups in order to think well of themselves, and even small or minimal threats affect our perceived identity. So during the course of these experiments and all the various times that this has been replicated, no group has shown immunity to this effect, and all groups tend to favor people who belong to their own groups. Another thing that's mentioned in this chapter is an interview on NPR with Ira Glass, where he discussed the concept of local identities. And local identities essentially means that our identities are shaped by our environments, and Steele says they do not travel well. And an example that's given here is an African-American woman who moved to Paris and found that her daily experiences were much different because her stereotype threat was much different in Paris than it was in the United States. And she felt that she could more comfortably go through her life without feeling threatened because of her race, or without feeling that she was at a disadvantage because of her race. So for chapter 4, there were 7 discussion questions, So the first says, Steele explains what Anatole Broyard gained when he decided to pass. What do you think that he lost? I would say that the main thing that Anatole Broyard lost when he decided to pass was a sense of community with a community that he actually belonged to. By choosing to give up his Black identity and pass as white, he essentially removed himself from the Black community, which would have given him a connection to his parents and to his wife who was Black and to his children who were Black. And I think essentially he gave that up when he decided to pass. Number 2 says, where might various populations experience the kind of identity contingencies that Steele describes on our campus? Where on our campus are you aware of an identity contingency that affects you? How does it affect you, and does it stop you or help you? This one is actually tricky for me because I have not been to Oneana's campus. I live in Oneana, but this program is online, and so I have not actually taken classes on campus. So I'm not really sure, and I don't know if any of you have taken classes on campus at SUNY Oneonta, but if anyone could weigh in on that, that would be interesting to hear, because I'm really not sure. My own campus, I went to a college in Amherst, New York, just outside of Buffalo, and that was fairly diverse, although I would say mostly white. And so there were things like there was a Black student union and a Black gospel choir and things like that, where it was obviously geared toward one specific social group. But in terms of SUNY Oneonta, I'm not really sure on that one. Number 3 says, a diffuse threat is preoccupying, and it preoccupies one with the identity it threatens. From reading Steele's explanation of identity contingencies in this chapter, how might you now respond to arguments that sexism, racism, classism, or anything else are more important than some other identity threat, and to arguments that certain groups complain too much? As Steele says, he refers to a diffuse threat as a snake loose in the house. So I think that we can't speak to others' experiences. To say that sexism or racism is more important than another threat is specific to our individual experiences. Sexism might play more of a role in my life than it does in someone else's, but for someone else, the threat might be much different, and we all perceive our threats in different ways or experience our threats in different ways. And the same goes for arguments that certain groups complain too much. Again, I think unless you're a member of that group, you can't really speak to that, because the threat is much different and everyone experiences those in different ways. Number 4 says, which of your social identities matters most to you in the settings you most often occupy? And what about the students with whom you work, and why? So the settings I most often occupy, I would say, are work and my home life. At work, the setting I most often occupy, I would say, or the identity that matters most to me in that setting, I would say probably my age. I'm 30 years old, and I am one of the younger teachers in my school. And so that matters most to me because I think it affects how my colleagues and my students relate to me. And I also think it makes me a different type of teacher than teachers who are much older. And for the students with whom I work, I would say for them, I'm not really sure. And again, I feel I can't truly speak to that because they experience things differently than me. I would say there appears from my end to be more awareness of sex or gender than race or any other social identity among my students, but I'm not sure if they would agree with that or not. And which of your social identities are the least threatened in the settings you most often occupy, and the students with whom you work, and why? So I am one of the younger teachers in my district, as I said, but I teach in the high school, and in my high school there are no teachers who are not white. So I would say that aspect of my social identity is certainly the least threatened because it's simply, there's no opportunities for it to be threatened. And even if there were, being a white person is difficult to say that it would be threatened in any situation, certainly. And the students with whom I work, I'm not sure. I would say probably for them it would be something like their age, maybe. I mean, they're certainly in the majority, so perhaps being young is not a source of barrier for them in that situation. Number 6 says, are any social identities valorized at our institution? How can you tell, and why those identities? Again, that's difficult for me to speak to, having not taken classes on campus. So I am not sure that I have a good answer to that one. And the last question for this chapter was, it says a quote that says, if you want to change the behaviors and outcomes associated with social identity, say too few women in computer science, don't focus on changing the internal manifestations of the identity, such as values and attitudes. Focus instead on changing the contingencies to which all of that internal stuff is an adaptation. So think about your own office or your unit's main office. What